That is amazing, like, isn't it? Yeah. Now we're back, and so people should be able to join. Like, people had signed up to come in with us. Nearly pressed the wrong button. So I'll just welcome everyone. We have a little bit of a live audience too, because we had originally scheduled it to be live, but then with our weather yesterday, it made travel difficult for Christian, especially up there in Washington, or down, I don't know the map, in Washington. So wherever you are, Christian, you're not in Albany. Yeah, exactly.
That's right, but they're in spirit and certainly here virtually. So excited.
Thank you. No, we're delighted to have you. It's great. So let me welcome the representatives from the African American Irish Diaspora Network, Lenwood, or Leni, Sloan and Christian Bolden. We're marking here at the Museum Black History Month, and in fact this is the first one in a series that we're going to do this year called The Irish And, where we'll discuss the Irish and other groups, because of course we famously get along well with and sometimes clash with Italians and Germans and African Americans and other groups. So it'll be an interesting year while we learn about how immigrants are sometimes forced to, you know, go against each other and sometimes learn to live with each other and to get stronger together. Leni was with us last July with Mick Moloney. We were just talking, the late, great Mick Moloney, and we talked that night about the interactions between Black and Irish Americans, particularly with music and dance. So we'll kind of revisit some of that. Leni is well known across the States as an animator, facilitator of culture and heritage programs. For 40 years, he's been involved in this kind of public education, and he is currently the executive director of the Pennsylvania Commonwealth Monument Project, which preserves, conserves, and rededicates historic and cultural monuments throughout the state. Christian Bolden, who I met, I'd say it was only last summer too, Christian, was it? We were on the panel together. Is a member of Washington, D.C.'s Urban League. He's originally from New Orleans, so we were just talking about Mardi Gras. He's the Urban League, he's in the Young Professionals chapter. He's a graduate of the University of Mobile, Alabama.
Yes, Mobile, there you go.
There you go. And obtained his master's in business administration at Syracuse here in New York. And he did spend time in Ireland then in both Dublin and Cork. He's a former professional staff member in the US House of Representatives and is now a business owner in the information technology and project management space, and a very proud board member, both of them are, of the African American Irish Diaspora Network. So
thanks for that warm introduction. Much appreciated.
Good. No, we're delighted to have you. So if you wanted to start maybe by telling us what is the African American Irish Diaspora Network, and, you know, why were you set up and what do you do?
Yeah, so absolutely. So the much of our mission is embedded right in our name, right? Really being a conduit for the African American and Irish communities. We pursue that. We pursue this synergy through three chief areas: social justice and civil rights, entrepreneurship, and arts and culture. The welcome that we've received from all corners of the Irish community and the African American community has been tremendous, right? If you could imagine, our roots began right on the edge of the pandemic. I remember being at the St. Patrick's Day breakfast here in Washington, D.C. And that night, you'll recall Tom Hanks kind of publicly came out that he'd contracted the virus. The NBA in real time, right? The National Basketball Association games were shutting down in real time. I mean, they're shooting free throws and then the referees come in and say, we're calling off the game, the league shutting things down. And I think it was at that moment, interesting enough that it coalesces with St. Patrick's Day, but it was at that moment that the country really began to reckon with and address, at least socially, the COVID-19 virus. And mind you, we're in the upstart stages, right? We're in our infancy with this organization. So the strides that we've made, the connections that we've made, the impact that we've tried to have has been absolutely tremendous, as I mentioned, on all corners of the globe, right? When you're talking about the work that we've done here in the United States, our relationships that we've developed with the State Department, consulate offices across the country, the Irish Embassy, and certainly the work that we've done in Ireland as well, when you're talking about Frederick Douglass Way. So it's been tremendous, the strides that we've made. We're continuing to learn, right? So we're in a learning posture. We're learning more about ourselves, about how we can really be advocates for both communities. Little known fact, as much as 40% or as many as 40% of African Americans actually have Irish heritage. Yeah. So the lineage is there, the roots are there, the foundation is there. our job, amongst other things, as far as we're concerned, is to illuminate those facts and drive the conversation in a way that really exploits and explores the commonalities between the two communities. So we're excited.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you bring up an excellent point, Christian. Like, and I loved Leni when Leni and Mick were here in July. You kind of started off by saying like we were in a safe space, and we're talking about difficult topics, and we might use the wrong language sometimes or the wrong verbiage. So can we kind of tease out that the 36 to 40% of African Americans have Irish heritage? We do a post, try to do it daily, where you're highlighting the African Americans with Irish, heritage. And of course, sometimes it's because a slave owner, possibly raped a slave, or today's post was about the Healy family, where it looks like the Irish immigrant was in love with his common law wife. She had been enslaved. There was a serious age difference, which is a little bit unfortunate, but he died very quickly after her. She died first. They had 9 children who lived to adulthood. He appears to have loved her. I think they were common law married, and he definitely sent his 9 children up north to be educated, because of course they were born, with the 1-drop rule. They would have been enslaved had they stayed in the South. And they go on to become, founders of Washington University, and the first African-American Jesuit, and the first Bishop of Maine, and all this, a Mother Superior. So Leni, how important is that Irish aspect of the African-American Irish diaspora?
So let me unpack some of that.
Okay,
because
yeah.
that was,
it's a lot.
There is a lot in there.
Yeah.
First, and I apologize to Miss Jean Crane, who, wherever she is. Jean Crane was my 8th grade math teacher, and I should know the reversal. But if the historical fact and the scientific fact that 38 to 40% of African Americans have at least one Irish ancestor, Irish ancestor, then there is a reversal formula that says X% of Irish have at least one African American ancestor. And we have worked in the 20th century to have African Americans acknowledge that the full equation of who we are. There is still some work to do about the Irish side of that equation, accepting that there might be, there could be. So I want to talk first about this myth of the plantation rape, because until about 1980, the feeling was, the assumption was that every mixed race child came out of the 19th century, came out of that notion of plantation rape. But these Irishmen didn't own any plantations. They were not masters of any great population. They were hard-working men who lived on the edge. So if you look at history from 1792, which is when we first start measuring this amalgamation, to 1850, in America, what you have is the average life expectancy of an Irish man is 36. The average life expectancy of an Irish woman is 18.
Wow. She would die in childbirth, maybe?
She would die in childbirth. She would die of plagues, famines, and I'm talking about in the Americas.
Okay.
Wow. The average life expectancy of an African American woman is 41. And the average life expectancy of an African American man is 14.
Okay. So there's gaps.
So what you have outside of urban areas and in rural is a high concentration of Black women and Irish men who begin to amalgamate for companionship, for farmers need sons.
Yeah.
You know, the number of reasons for the amalgamation before 1850. After 1850, it reverses. What you have is a high concentration of Irish women and a high concentration of Black men amalgamating. Why? Because women are following their fathers, brothers, uncles into America post-famine and finding primarily domestic jobs, and they're gravitating to African-American free men who have what is called clean jobs.
Yeah.
You know, now we look at those clean jobs, they're waiters, they're butlers, they're porters on the trains, but those were jobs, you weren't digging ditches. You know, so
wow.
the average person who, before emancipation, you got two people, they got to dig a ditch. One is enslaved, which means that he is worth $500. The other is an Irishman who's not worth anything. You know, in the census. So you don't use your enslaved person to dig the ditch. You use your Irishman. There is a kind of tension that begins to grow from this. And again, I'm talking before 1865. Before 1865 and emancipation, the law requires, it's not followed, but the law requires that if you own an enslaved person, you pay taxes on them. You must provide them with at least one hot meal a day, and you must provide them with one set of summer clothes and one set of winter clothes. For the Irishman,
there's no provision.
There's no provision. However, the Irishman can vote. He is indentured, which means that he can work off his servitude, whereas the African-American enslaved man is a perpetual slavery. So you get one set of things going on that are economic realities around labor, jobs, land, status. You get another thing out of need for companionship, out of people who are living on the edges of society, beyond the city stone, outside of the common good, gather in places like Allegheny City, which is across the river from Pittsburgh, or Five Corners, or East Cincinnati. And these Black and Irish, and usually German, Black, Irish, and German communities begin to go on despite what the law says. And so our census change. In the 1820 census, there's Black and white. That's it. In the 1830 census, there's Black, white, and other, and the other is usually a Scots Irish. In the 1840 census, there is Black, colored, mulatto,
just mixed,
white, and other. In the 1850 census, there is Black, colored, quadroon, octoroon, place blanc. Place blanc means to pass for white. It's a legal term in that census, you know? And so the Healy's are place blanc. They're passing for white, you know? Now, were the Healy's the first Black anythings? No.
No,
because they never claimed. They never.
Yeah.
The Healy's would be rolling over in their graves right now if we outed the Healy's in the 21st century. You know, but the Healy's never claimed an African American identity. They never related. So you can't call Healy the first Black president of a university when he never called himself that. You know, unlike Lydia Hamilton Smith, for example. Now, Lydia Hamilton Smith was an octoroon, meaning she was 1/8 Black.
Mhm.
Her father was an Irishman.
Mhm.
She lived in Gettysburg. She was the confidant and the housekeeper and the manager for Thaddeus Stevens.
Mhm.
Thaddeus Stevens left her wealth in his will.
Mm.
He left her the plot to be buried next to him.
Wow.
He raised her children. So we would call this a common law relationship. D.W. Griffith
Mhm.
in Birth of a Nation, and to some degree, the recent movie of Lincoln
Mhm.
reduced that relationship to a sexual one
Mhm.
or a sensual one. But it was really the confidence and the support
Mhm.
that those two people of different races gave each other.
Mhm.
And so we have a tremendous number, I think in 21 states where the numbers are up around 40% because of this amalgamation of races. And so I was excited with the network,
Yeah.
looking at the network through 3 different lenses. And I see we all wear glasses that are in this room. So you know that thing where they go with the lenses, is this clearer? Is this, like, well, if you're blind, how do you know which one is clearer? So
Yeah.
we're blind to any reality except race.
Yeah.
As the cause
Mhm.
for we are not blind to the pressures of labor unions, to race riots, and to conflicts, but we are blind. So now we're in a generation where if you've been watching TV, every 3rd commercial is a mixed race couple.
Yeah.
That's because our kids are already there.
Yeah.
Madison Avenue is already there.
Yeah.
We're still in the 19 catching
Yeah.
up. We're still in the 19. We're still before Love versus
Virginia.
Virginia.
Yeah. In the 50s.
In the 50s.
Or 60s, maybe. Yeah.
So I'm looking at three things. I am looking at repairing the relationship, the historic relationship between Black and Irish is one. 2 is acknowledging and exalting the contributions that the cultures have made together in what I am too from New Orleans, the great gumbo, which Irish and African Americans made primarily in music, literature, humor, jokes. But the third, as I'm looking at, is this new rising generation of children who are both and have the right to claim both. And the network provides common ground. Check your weapons at the door. Like we can talk here. And it also provides the intellectual study of the contributions. By that, Christian, I mean, for example, Amazing Grace. The song Amazing Grace is embraced across several cultures and relationships, but it is a signature song in the African American community. When Obama started singing Amazing Grace, at the funeral, well, very few people know that an Irishman wrote Amazing Grace. John Newton was an Irishman. He was an enslaver. He wrote the song because of a miracle of his life being saved he was illegally transporting enslaved people when the Atlantic slave trade was actually ended. His ship wrecked. and he was saved by one of the enslaved men who had been chained to a board and used the board as a raft,
Yeah.
and he pulls him out. So when, you know, when Black folks are singing Amazing Grace, they're embracing this Irish moment when Irishmen and Englishmen and Scotsmen and Linda Ronstadt and, you know, Willie Nelson and all were singing Amazing Grace. They don't know that the song is rooted. Pass me not, O gentle Savior. Hear my humble cry, while all others thou art calling. Do not pass me by. It is well with my soul. These songs were written by Irishmen, taken up and set to new African melodies and rhythms, and become the warp and woof of the faith songs that we sing across our churches. So that's gumbo culture. You know, now.
Well, and Christian, to pick up on a little bit of that, I think you're exactly right. And every time I write about the Healy's, I kind of panic because there are several African-American sites who, you know, don't claim them, are very, I won't say negative or hostile, but like, you know, you were right. They didn't claim themselves as Black people. They went, I mean, some people knew, one or two of the brothers looked a little bit mixed, and apparently like their higher ups in the church knew. But it is important, Christian, that like African Americans speak for themselves, you know, and that we don't have white people telling the story anymore. Or like, how is that dialogue, particularly with a slash African American Irish network? How important is it to give voice to Black people telling Black stories?
No, I think it's becoming increasingly important. I think what we're seeing a very contemporary version of this. And what I refer to as kind of the post-George Floyd era, where we've seen much of the country reckon with itself, right? And you know, the knee to the neck on the part of the police officer really made us evaluate ourselves and look in the mirror across the country, across all socioeconomic backgrounds and racial backgrounds and otherwise, and say, we're better than this, right? And so I think born out of that moment of reckoning was an acknowledgement of just some of the challenges that minorities broadly and African Americans in particular face. I know in my own personal experience, as you mentioned at the top, I studied in Cork and in Dublin. As I got off the plane, so gosh, this is like back in 2017. So as I arrived off the plane, the Alton Sterling murder had happened at the hands of the police in Baton Rouge. And then there's another murder in Minneapolis, right? That really, really shook the country up once again at the hands of the police. And so I was confronted with a variety of questions. I kind of stuck out like a sore thumb, 6'3", 205-pound Black man, just kind of ascending on the country. And they were aware that I think the refugee crisis was kind of occurring simultaneously. So they could kind of identify even from afar that I wasn't Syrian, right? Yeah. And so I think everyone came to me and approached me with curiosity. I think one of the first questions that I was asked was, you know, you're an African-American male or you're a Black man in America. How are you confronting the idea that you could be murdered or killed at the hands of the police? The psychological impact of that is burdensome enough, let alone you actually seeing that bear out over the course of history. And then at that time, just a week ago, right? So, you know, there was a lot of talk, a lot of curiosity around that. Just, you know, how are you holding up emotionally, psychologically? What does that mean for you when you feel hunted by the very people that should be protecting you? So there was a lot of discussion around that. Simultaneously, Muhammad Ali just passed away. Yeah. And
huge hero in Ireland.
Oh my goodness. And I'm unaware of this, but I'll tell you a brief story. I had a gentleman who was there from London to see his nephew who he hadn't seen in 25 years. I pop into a restaurant, I lean in and say, hey, was the food good? He hears my accent or lack thereof, that I'm not, that I'm not local. He said, you're an American. Muhammad Ali was my hero. he sat there and talked to me for 2.5 hours, told his nephew and his wife, with whom he hadn't seen in 25 years, you guys go ahead. I want to stick back and talk to this gentleman, right? So
Which is all you needed.
unbelievable. Yeah, unbelievable. But the lesson there for me was, again, the curiosity, the interest, and a certain affinity. Certainly, I think it also illuminated to me just how huge Muhammad Ali was. When you go abroad and someone says this person passed, they were a hero of mine. I mean, I couldn't imagine. One of the last things I thought I was going to confront was the idea of, one of my own personal heroes of a generation past who really meant so much globally. And it really gave me an understanding of just how significant an icon he actually was. And then, of course, lastly, I think there was this fascination with the idea that this gentleman from a TV show on NBC called The Apprentice was running for president of the United States, and what that was going to mean for the country. And so people were just saying, my introduction to Donald Trump was in Home Alone 2, right? And in the movie as a child, right? Yeah, and a generation before mine, although Mike Tyson was kind of in my orbit, generation before mine was he hosting the fights in Atlantic City with some of the hotels he owned. You know what I mean? And then prior to that, I think for the locals in New York, they'd been kind of made aware of who he was some 35, 40 years ago, right? But for them, their introduction to him was through the TV show The Apprentice. And they're like, what are you guys really going to make this TV personality president of the United States? And so all of these things created an opportunity for us to connect in a really organic manner. But to your point, to the specific question that you were asking, it also gave me a lane through which to really tell the African-American story, right? Abroad in Ireland. The reception that I received was phenomenal. But I think when we come to the table, when we come to any conversation with a sense of openness, with a sense of curiosity, and with a sense of purpose and love, I think that the conversations can go any direction. And there are times where things can be, offensive or they can be otherwise hurtful, right? But I think what we have to do is take a step back, view things through the lens of empathy, and say, and evaluate the spirit of the individual and the spirit of the question that they're asking. I think that leads to some sort of reconciliation, but also it addresses maybe some of the outstanding issues and challenges that an individual faces when they're trying to confront themselves. Certainly for me, having studied in Ireland, the experience made me a more comprehensive version of myself. You know what I mean? It made me understand who I was and the space that I occupy in this world. It was really fundamental to that, right? To be on an island where there very literally is no one else like me, right? And to be embraced and accepted the way that I was, coming from a city as my counterpart here, coming from a city in New Orleans, where we also have a very distinct culture. So, we have our own food, we have our own dance, we have our own dialect, we have our own way of life, we have our own music, right? So when I travel abroad, I immediately, for me personally, having grown up in that environment, I travel abroad, I immediately identify with a place that has their own food, their own language, their own dialects, their own culture, their own music, right? And so for me to go there and learn more about them enabled or facilitated my ability to learn more about myself. And I think that's the ultimate goal, right? We're not here to necessarily change minds, but what we are here to do is have an open dialogue about things that otherwise can't be discussed, about to talk to people who are trying to discover something more about themselves and others, and for people who aspire to a greater sense of personal identity, and also, at least in the United States, aspire to a greater America, its highest aspirations, right? Which speak to liberty and justice for all. And so we're excited about the role that we can play in that, and the ability to tell African-American stories and stories of people of color. I come from the South, of course, to tell those stories on behalf of an entire community is a responsibility that we don't take lightly, but also to encounter the people that we have to this point and their openness and their interest in that, you know, it really goes a long way. And so it's a two-way street.
You know, I would love to begin to build an Afro-Gaelic imagination of ourselves, an Afro-Gaelic imagination, because well, for example, I'm trying to finish a song for Mick Moloney that I started. We toured and worked together for 40 years. We were colleagues, and from Cuba to Limerick, and from Zimbabwe to Mexico City. You know, we talked about music, dance, humor, the notion of crack.
Yeah.
You know, this
The Irish crack.
the Irish crack,
Yeah.
you know, and cracker culture.
Yeah.
You know, I want to give you all a short book list that might help frame some of the things that Chris and I are talking about. The first is a book called Reimagining Ireland. Reimagining Ireland. Reimagining Ireland was a book that came out of a conference at the University of Virginia. It was a brilliant conference. 200 thought leaders, scholars, humanists, and artists were brought together for a week to discuss what is Ireland. Is Ireland the 4+ million people on the island? Or is it the 40 million plus people in the world, you know, who see themselves and claim an Irish identity despite what the color of their skin is? And it looks at every aspect of this question of what is Ireland and who gets the right to claim it. Very important book. The second book is Ignatius's book, How the Irish Became White. And if you have not read this book, it's a very important book for you to read. It's somewhat disputed now because scholars think that he used what is referred to as assumptive dialogue. If you get enough facts together, you can make an assumption from them. But the book centers around the census and how the Irish workers were given the right in the census to check white in exchange for participating in
white privilege, sort of,
privilege in the control of migration of Blacks from the South to the North. And this book is really important because it talks about Irishmen being given the jobs of firemen, policemen, and magistrates to control the migration of Blacks into urban cities, to be the might force that winds up in riots and resistance like Wilmington. It's a really important book. The third is called Hell or Barbados. And Hell or Barbados.
I'm surprised you're recommending that.
Yes, you know, this is the book that says we clean the prisons up. We can say, you know, we can assassinate you. You can go to hell, or we can send you to Barbados. You know, and so a period of time where the Caribbean ring was flooded with Irish men, not women. So, you know, what are you going to do? You're going to intermarry. You know, you're going to, after 2 or 3 generations. Hell or Barbados talks about the population of the Caribbean ring by the injection of Irishmen who had essentially the reverse, just like Christian and I could be noticed immediately in the crowd in
Cork.
Cork, you know.
Yeah.
These Irish men in Montserrat, you know, I could not escape
Yeah.
until their prison time was over, which is usually 27 years. And so the book ends with a very interesting set of assumptions. It says the reason why they were referred to as the Red Legs, the reason why the Red Legs, which were the pure Irish in the Caribbean ring, died out, is because they would not intermarry.
Right.
You know, and so they became genetically weak.
Yeah.
And the strain.
Well, you can't withstand the sun. Look, you
Yeah.
know, like, it's not good for us.
But the writer says that the advice to Irishmen was to intermarry. So you strengthen your, you know, nowhere else have I ever heard that.
I know.
You know? So Hail to Barbados is a very interesting book because it talks about the Caribbean ring. And it's very important for Ireland, that book, because when you look at Irish, slow down there, I get excited. When you look at Ireland's Black History Month, Ireland's Black History Month is in October, because the Black history that they're talking about is a Caribbean history. It's not an American history, you know? And so I mean, it's a whole different paradigm, the relationship of Irish men who were shipped into the Caribbean, intermarried, and then their children and descendants coming back into America. And it's a very interesting book. Love and Theft is another very important book. Eric Lott's book, Love and Theft, is about Irishmen coming to America and succeeding by putting on blackface and performing on the American stage, you know. And what you get is the upward mobility from is to portray, mimic, caricature, you know, diminish, you know, the black, the way you succeed. So then, because the American stage is developed this way, from 1820 to 1870, the way for an Irishman to succeed in America is to get a banjo and portray himself as a black man. I said I'm writing this poem for Mick because the poem is called He Held Africa in His Hands, because very few Irishmen know that the banjo is an African instrument. You know, it came into Irish American culture through the minstrel shows, and it was then transported to Ireland and reintroduced by men like Mick Moloney in the 50s, 1950s and 1960s. It is now the signature instrument in the Irish band. So every Irishman, whatever he thinks about Black folks, he doesn't realize that he's holding Africa, that he's playing Africa, you know, and that if we can get into that kind of, and then the last book is a very interesting book. It is a book that our dear friend and colleague, Miriam Nyland, introduced to me. It's called Mother of Orphans. And Mother of Orphans takes place between 1920 and 1960. And it is an Irish woman who marries a Black man. They have 11 children and he dies. So she has to put them in the Catholic orphanages.
At home in Ireland?
No, here in America.
Here.
And in Ireland. She puts, and then the rest of the book, she is attempting to find her children again as they assimilate or pass. And it's a contemporary story about genealogy. And some children who she finds who didn't know they were Black and refused to receive her. Some children she finds who says, I'm black, you know, I'm like, right on, I'm Black and I'm proud, and I deny that Irish side of my family. The Louis Gates piece last week with Angela Davis and with Johnson, help me, Chris.
Was it The Rock?
The Attorney General under under Obama.
On the Who Do You Think You Are show, or whatever it's called. Trace Your Roots,
Yeah.
Holder. That's what I'm thinking about. Holder.
Excellent.
So both of them found out last Tuesday that they were Black and Irish.
Wow.
Angela Davis was devastated. She was more than shocked. She said, "This is like this. You just really rocked my boat here." Wow. Mr. Holder couldn't believe that the relationship could be one of romance and sexuality. But Gates kept reminding him that these people lived together for 60 years after emancipation. So they didn't have to stay there. Yeah. We also discovered in that story that he had purchased his wife because the state of Virginia said that if you are free, you have to leave the state within 30 days. Wow. So freedom meant leaving your family behind. And so this is all so complex.
Absolutely.
Are we talking about who invented tap? And everybody says, if did the Irish invent tap or the Black folks invent tap? And I say yes. Yeah. The answer is yes. Yeah. As our Savion Glover showed us at our annual gala, Savion Glover was brilliant. So are we talking about music, art, culture, expression? Are we talking about work songs? The last book was called Singing the Master. And it's a beautiful book. Singing the Master is about Black and Irish road gangs on the railroad, canal diggers, farmers at harvest time, and how they would hear each other's songs and they would trade each other's songs, particularly taking a melody of an Irish song and adding more percussion and syncopation to it to make it Afrocentric, or taking an Afrocentric song and adding more melodic instruments to it, and Singing the Master talks about the fact that even though they didn't like each other, they still absorbed each other, and that absorption,
and imagine you're probably competing for labor conditions on the railroad and being used to strike break against each other, and yet you can see the humanity in each other because you're both singing, and so it's like that World War I story, where the Germans and the English come on to no man's land and play football, So Christian, Leni just raised a really interesting point there. Like, this stuff is very complicated. Like, it's not a binary, who's right and who's wrong. And, the Black community have probably to, like Angela Davis, it's, you're not always delighted when you find out what's going on, or you would maybe deny people who passed for white a long time ago. Even Alice Walker kind of got into trouble, in her lifetime. So, Christian, where are we? And maybe this is too complicated a question for tonight, but this whole critical race theory, which I can tell you as a college professor, used to be, there's not a book that's, here is the critical race theory and teach it like this, liberals, and the whole, I can't remember if it's 1692 or 1642, but the New York Times project,
1690,
which is so important, how are we to kind of grapple with all of this when there's sections of the country who are determined to strip away the nuance and strip away the hard stories, which we have to kind of grapple with?
So there's 2 points there in my view. One macro and then one I think that's very specific to critical race theory. The macro being the idea that often when you are in a capitalistic society, you simultaneously subscribe to the notion that various parts, particularly when you're talking about economics and politics, that it's a zero-sum game. That if they have, that means I don't. And if I have, that means they don't. And often it results in pitting ourselves against one another. So when you're talking about something like what we're doing, or diversity, equity, inclusion, and access work in general, the idea is that the challenge that you're confronting is the notion that there are only but so many seats at the table, right? And that if I'm not at the table, that means that somebody else is at the table. So affirmative action programs for some parts of our society, they feel as though those people are cutting in line. That I am on this path to the American dream, whatever version of the American dream that they aspire to, and that this person, that they are somehow given a pass or placed in front of me on the basis of something that I myself can't even control. Never mind the conditions that underserved member of society is confronting. I myself am not creating those conditions, and yet they get, their resume at the top of the pile, or they have to meet some sort of quota, right?
Yeah.
So the zero-sum game notion, I think as a society, we have to move away from the idea that we're playing a game of musical chairs. Rather, we're building a bigger table. Yeah. That's what the objective is, right? That's the highest ideal, is that we're building a bigger table, that there is enough for everyone, right? We just have to ensure that it's shared equitably, to kind of coin a phrase. So I think that's one of the macro level challenges. We have to kind of address our psychology around, the ever elusive dollar bill. And if it's going in one man's pocket, or if it's going in one direction, that it's not going in our direction. When in fact, there are other dollars and cents floating around. We want to ensure that there's an opportunity for others to have access to that, whether we're talking about access to housing, whether we're talking about access to capital, whether we're talking about access to education, and what that means and the influence that can have on a human being, and certainly on a generation. I mean, one of the things I learned with my work, doing my policy work, when I worked on Capitol Hill and I was on the Committee on Homeland Security, I don't think people really have a understanding of how the breadth and the depth of policy and what it could mean for years, and in some cases generations, and beyond that even centuries, right? You're talking about areas you're talking about areas of the country that have been redlined previously, right? Where banks were very deliberately and intentionally keeping African Americans from certain communities in certain parts of cities, particularly urban cities across the country. Some of those communities have still not been inhabited by African Americans today, even though there's more affluence, even though there's greater access to education, even though there's more money. We still have a long way to go when we're having those discussions. But I think we need to move away from that psychology. And to the point that you make about critical race theory, I think critical race theory is important, but I think it's poorly marketed. And it lends itself to being flipped on its head, right? So whatever we may think from our points of view about critical race theory, independent of a formal definition, it is subject to interpretation and thereby manipulation by others. So now it's trickled down to that we're getting rid of AP African American Studies across the country. I was most notably in the state of Florida, right? And this idea that another term that I think is loosely defined and also subject to being interpreted is being woke. What does that mean exactly? What does critical race mean exactly? Now, woke is more of a buzz term, right? Critical race theory, actually, there's a technical connotation to it. But depending upon the audience, I mean, I have time or the bandwidth, whether that is literal time or psychological, or in some cases even educational bandwidth, to give it the proper attention and education and that it deserves. And so as a result, I'm being told what it means. as opposed to exploring what it actually means myself. And I think as a result of that, we're finding that it's being manipulated. And then again, one of the components of that, or the subtext of that, is the idea that
You just
my
froze, Christian. I don't know if it's me or you. Oh, it's your back. Okay, good.
yeah.
Yeah.
The idea that my son or my daughter, my child, who's in a school system, should not be made to feel guilty about the conditions created by their forefathers. And I don't want them going around feeling as though they're racist, which is certainly not the intent. The intent is there's a part of America that I think, if presented through an educational lens rather than through the media or through even Madison Avenue, as my colleague mentioned, I think educationally it lends itself to the appropriate and proper context and to frame it in the correct manner, right? Yeah. And so, if I may, I think those two things, right? The zero-sum game theory that permeates, and actually, if you look historically, I think, let's not kid ourselves. The African American and Irish community has a sordid past itself, right? A very complicated past itself. But it's born out of that, this idea that we need to appeal to a certain group of people in the interest of our own validation, right? And trying to find footing in this foreign land. So I think we need to move away from those concepts and those psychologies around the zero-sum game theory. And then, of course, critical race theory, again, I just think it needs to be, it's a very technical term. I think it's a lot to unpack. I think it has to be, I think ideally it would be simplified in a manner in which it would eliminate or reduce its ability to be manipulated. Yeah. And, that's incumbent upon people like us to carry that torch. And so I think I answered your question, right?
I wanted to add, Chris, that we're looking at AAIDN, we're looking at very complex and overlapping things, because we're looking at the way that Blacks and Irish relate to each other. We're looking at the way that our Irish Americans look at Irish and back and forth. We're looking at the distinction between now African Americans and Caribbean Africans and their relationships, some relationships which come whole cloth by the time they arrive. So if you're looking at, for example, Jamaica, right? Yeah, Irish and Black, indigenous Irish and enslaved Blacks are being brought at the same time. So they've had a cultural relationship or not before they get here that's added on to the culture. There is a really brilliant woman named Dr. Marta Vega. She is the director of the Caribbean Cultural Center in New York City. And she says, within my race, there are many cultures. And she said, there's a difference between race and culture. And we sometimes confuse those and use them as synonyms. So there were Irishmen in America who exalted the relationship that Frederick Douglass and Daniel O'Connell had because of the high ideals. But on the block, the anthracite coal miners and the bituminous coal miners were fighting together against each other. That wasn't really about their nationality. That was about the way they were being used against each other. Economically. And economically. And so it's hard when somebody else is holding your coat while you're beating each other up. I'm trying to find not the cause of why I took the first strike at you or you took the first strike at me, but who set us up? Yeah. And so you got to look at Wilmington, North Carolina, and the red shirts. Red shirts were Irish gangs who were contracted to burn out Black neighborhoods. And one of the chief architects of that was Woodrow Wilson, who segregated the White House as soon as he became president. So, we don't, you need to go back a little further.
Yeah, it's
because
Wilmington. Bring out the
you
names.
gotta come out and say, well,
Yeah.
you mean to tell me that the Confederate flag that we know is not the Confederate flag of the end of the Civil War? The flag that we know was a flag that was created in 1930 at the resurgence of Jim Crow, of the KKK again, and it was carried by people who were told in the romanticization, that's a word I can't get out, of the noble cause. That these young Irish Confederate soldiers were promised land, and they were promised the same land that Stewart and Cameron, who worked for Lincoln, had promised to blacks. The 30 acres and a mule was a real thing. The northern part of South Carolina and the southern part of North Carolina were set aside between 1865 and 1868 to divide so that each freedman would receive enough land to feed his family for a year. That land was taken from the Freedmen's Bureau and given to Irish soldiers of the Union and the Confederacy to pay them back for salaries that they weren't paid after the war. So now you got a conflict that is even about something else. It's putting the same envelope as you're Irish, I'm black, we hate each other. When I went to school in Philadelphia at Temple University, I lived in North Broad Street, African American community. I had to walk to campus. The shortest way was through Kensington, the Irish neighborhood. But I was told from the first day, don't you ever find yourself. I had to walk a mile and a half around Kensington so that my head wasn't busted. And what was happening there is that young Irish boys in the Kensington neighborhood, Chris, were being given their rite of passage by them taking the sledgehammers and going into the black cemeteries and smashing the gravestones. And it was like a hazing. You did it because you were going to be a policeman or a fireman, and that was the tradition.
And the sad thing is Kensington in the 1820s and the 1830s was burnt by the Protestants because it was Catholic. So we had, these wasp fires, it's just,
right.
Yeah, it's a nightmare.
So it's very complicated. If we can set up a place where we are talking about our contributions to each other's language and music, song and color? Are we talking about the political strife of moving from rural to urban? Are we talking about coal and steel miners and bricklayer wars, which really have nothing to do with the color of your skin, but have to do with who gets? So we need referees.
We do.
And AAIDN is kind of a referee for a lot of these conversations.
Well, let me just check if there was any questions online or of our audience. Do you guys have questions here?
I have a personal question for Christian, is that what was the impetus for him going to Ireland in the first place?
I don't know if you heard that, Chris. What was your impetus for going to Ireland in the first place?
So part of my residency in the MBA program at Syracuse involved spending time in Ireland. So learning not just about the culture, I learned about Gaelic games, which was a lot of fun. We spent time. Can you hear me?
We can.
You hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, so I spent time learning about Gaelic games, which was really fun. I played locally at a club and was introduced to it with a coach and actually played the game, which was fantastic. But also spent time at the likes of Google and Pfizer and Facebook and any company, large scale company that you can imagine in the United States. It is in Ireland, little known fact. that Ireland has a extremely attractive corporate tax rate.
Yeah.
At that point,
Which I think we're in danger of losing any day now because of
yeah,
the
at that point it was 11.5%. It was
Yeah.
on the edges of just on the which I think largely contributed in some ways to the Celtic Tiger.
absolutely,
But,
yeah.
yeah, but also simultaneously, while I was there, we were in the midst of confronting, or you were in the midst of confronting Brexit and what that
Yes.
actually meant for the island, and many of the other European countries, of course. We also spent time in London. We asked people who were in Parliament, what do they know about Brexit? What can they tell us? I mean, we're in the MBA program. We thought we were asking really sophisticated questions and certainly trying to impress the people.
They couldn't answer you, I bet
we
you.
had no idea. Yeah, and I'm like, what do you mean? Everybody's like, what do you mean you have no idea? You're involved. They're like, yeah, we legitimately don't know.
Yeah.
And so I got a certain, obviously I was educated in a variety of spaces that included politics. I learned about business. The Celtic Tiger was something I was introduced to, that financial and economic renaissance of the country and how it really propped itself up. I think there were many lessons out of that that was introduced to, particularly when you're talking about the financial crisis in 2009 that the United States was confronting. I was really excited about that. So no, my studies brought me to Ireland, and again, really, really, really influential in my personal growth and evolution.
I went to Ireland the first time. I was a dancer in my first career, and I went to follow a man by the name of William Henry Lane, Master Juba, who was a jig and hornpipe dancer who had challenged an Irishman named John Diamond in New York City and won a tour of Ireland and England. And I went there to try to recreate his tour. And so I went as an artist the first time. The second time I went as a scholar with Mick Moloney. We were in Limerick for 6 months and in Galway for 6 months, teaching and working. The third time I went to find my great-grandfather is an Irishman. My great-grandmother is Irish.
Wow.
My great-grandfather is from Kilkenny, and my great-grandmother is from New York, from Cork, and they came to America in 1836.
Wow.
I was able to follow them, and I wanted to go to Kilkenny, and particularly to the church in the parish, and to do research. My kids know that when I retire, if I ever really do, then I'm going to be in some cottage in the Dingle Peninsula.
Oh, great.
That's where I'm going to go. Like howling at the full moon. And,
well, the locals will love that. They'll be out with you. I'm from Kerry, so we always try and push Kerry. We had a comment online, the Brass Dancing Institute, Bamore Brass Dancing Institute said, I love that idea of the Afro-Celtic imagination. And so we don't, was there any other questions from our audience here? Our room here is freezing. We were having problems with heating in the museum all week. My office is like a sauna, so we had to come out front and now we're freezing.
Oh no.
Yeah. But it's not snowing outside, so we're good. But thank you guys. I think this has been, the start of the conversation. I think there's plenty of work to be done, but I'm very hopeful, and I think I certainly think Irish America is starting to become aware of like those myths we've told ourselves about, white slavery and all of that. Like, we have to confront that kind of stuff head on, like that there was a legal distinction between indentured servitude and chattel slavery, which is very, very important and like should not be minimized. Of course, the life of an indentured servant was horrific, but you had rights under the law that an enslaved person did not have. And so those are some of the things that Irish America, grappled
and
with.
To untangle the issues around labor,
Yeah.
From the issues around race.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because we're so knotted
Yeah.
around the conflicts of coal miners, railroad, canal workers,
Strikes.
stevedores,
Yeah.
strikes, that much of the conflict is embedded in that.
And I think that was a little bit of my problem with Ignatiev's book. There's another very good book about that topic called The Wages of Whiteness. I can't remember Goldstein I can't remember the name of whoever wrote it, but I thought a little bit more nuanced because it handles the economics, of the whole thing rather than focusing on the race.
But we learn more.
But we learn, exactly.
And
you don't have to agree.
you don't have to agree. You just have to.
Yeah.
You just have to agree to check your weapons at the door.
Yeah.
But,
And there was a brilliant book about redlining in Chicago. I think it might be called Redline. or Rent. I can't remember, but yeah.
Sure.
So guys, thank you both very much. We will definitely have you back.
Elizabeth, listen, on behalf of Dennis, who is the president of our organization, he sends his best. I met you in the summer and out in New York, and the relationship between yourself, obviously on a personal level, and the organization, but certainly the African American Irish Diaspora Network and the Irish American Heritage Museum is one that we really find enriching. And so we really appreciate your support and your contribution and your willingness to give us a platform to talk about and have these discussions. So thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
And I would say, just like with the Underground Railroad, where there needed to be safe houses where you just rested from the conflict, so this is a safe house for people to have this conversation, and love you to explore Afro-Gaelic relations in Albany. That should be there.
We are looking forward to it. We have we have an Underground Railroad Education Center here, and they've been down, for other times to give talks. And we have an African American Community Center that I'd like to get more involved with. I met them recently at something, but we must have them over. And we do have an exhibition just for another week because we have to put up something extra for March, but our exhibit is about Frederick Douglass in Ireland this month to honor that trip. So thank you everyone who came.
May I give you one more little last thing to look at? One last little thing to look at is also the relationship between the Hedge School and the Underground Railroad schoolhouse. Because the movement of the Hedge School of it being outlawed to teach, is really parallel to the laws in America about outlawing education and literacy. And it's why we find ourselves in this new educational dilemma.
Absolutely, Well, no, I think, this has been fabulous. And I think, as you said, the more we read and the more we learn and talk and share, we see the shared humanity. And there's so much in common in our stories. But as Christian said, it doesn't have to be a zero-sum game either when you're talking about, the suffering Olympics, kind of thing. And so I'm really glad that we've had this.
I just think when I was at Derry to find the civil rights movement.
It's
right there. And this is something I was.
Oh, absolutely. I
was very much in the civil rights. I grew up in the 50s and 60s. So I was and I was quite.
One of our audience members just said about the American civil rights movement being so present in the Irish civil rights movement up in the north. We actually had a guy give an amazing talk. He wrote a book called, I think it's called Green and Black. I'll have to check that. He spoke for us on Martin Luther King Day about, Bernadette Devlin came over and was given the freedom of the city someplace, and she gave it to Angela Davis in prison, and that was huge communication between them.
One of my most favorite experiences of the year is every summer at the Wisconsin Irish Festival, where I teach in the Hedge School, and we show these similarities of it being illegal to learn to read and how that common issue should be a common advocacy now.
Yeah, absolutely. So. Advocacy now would be beautiful. Yeah. So listen, guys, thank you so much. I think, as Christian says, we're encouraging everyone to build a bigger table. That's my takeaway from the whole thing. And, Irish people are supposed to be welcoming. Céad Míle Fáilte means 100,000 welcomes. So there should be room at our table always for others. So thank you both for coming.
AAIDN.org.
Yes.
.org.
Yeah.
There's lots of great stuff there.
There is. And we'll put that on this talk, we'll put the website linked onto the YouTube. Yeah. So thank you very much, Christian. Take care, and we'll see you in person at some stage soon, I hope.
Sounds good. The weather just prevented me from being present.
You were dead right. Yeah, it was messy here last night. You wouldn't have been.
Brother, I sloshed here. So you
awesome.